It was the battle that started the American Civil War. For 34 straight hours, Fort Sumter was pounded by nearly 4,000 artillery shells, a storm of iron and fire designed to kill. But when the smoke cleared, the number of combat casualties was a staggering 0. 0 soldiers were killed. How is that possible? A 34-hour firefight with no casualties. Furthermore, if the Union defenders were unharmed, why did they surrender the fort, handing the Confederacy its first shocking victory? The truth is far stranger than legend. We find out all of that and more in tonight's stories. The first shots of the American Civil War, a conflict that would tear the nation apart and redefine its very soul, rang out not on a sprawling battlefield, but across the waters of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The target was Fort Sumter, a formidable but unfinished federal installation. The events of April 12th through April 14th in the year 1861 were the culmination of decades of simmering tensions over states' rights, economic disparities, and, most profoundly, the institution of slavery. South Carolina, long a hotbed of secessionist sentiment, had declared its departure from the Union on December 20th, 1860, shortly after the election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican whose party platform opposed the expansion of slavery. Other Southern states quickly followed, forming the Confederate States of America. As these states seceded, they began seizing federal property within their borders, arsenals, mints, and forts. In Charleston, the situation was particularly tense. Several federal military installations dotted the harbor, including Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, Castle Pinckney near the city, and the still under construction Fort Sumter, strategically positioned on a man-made island at the harbor's entrance. The small U.S. Army garrison, numbering fewer than 90 men, was under the command of Major Robert Anderson. Anderson, a Kentuckian by birth but a loyal Union officer, recognized the vulnerability of his position at Fort Moultrie, which was easily susceptible to land-based attack. Under the cover of darkness on December 26, 1860, he made a bold and decisive move. He secretly relocated his entire command from Fort Moultrie to the more defensible, though incomplete, Fort Sumter. This relocation infuriated South Carolinians, who viewed it as an act of aggression and a violation of an unspoken understanding that the federal government would not alter the military status quo in Charleston. Governor Francis W. Pickens of South Carolina immediately demanded Anderson's return to Fort Moultrie, a demand Anderson flatly refused. The Confederate authorities, now including Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, who had ironically been one of Anderson's artillery students at West Point, began to encircle Fort Sumter. They fortified existing positions, including Fort Moultrie and Castle Pinckney, and constructed new batteries on Morris Island, James Island, and Sullivan's Island, effectively placing Sumter under a ring of Confederate cannons. President James Buchanan, in the waning days of his administration, struggled to find a solution. He was reluctant to take any action that might provoke war, but also unwilling to formally recognize the Confederacy or surrender federal property. In early January 1861, Buchanan authorized an unarmed merchant ship, the Star of the West, to carry troops and supplies to Fort Sumter. However, as the Star of the West approached Charleston Harbor on January 9, 1861, Confederate batteries, manned by cadets from the Citadel, opened fire. The ship was struck several times and, lacking naval escort or the means to defend itself, was forced to turn back. This was the first overt act of hostility by the Confederacy against the U.S. government, a clear indication that the crisis was escalating beyond peaceful resolution. When Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, the situation at Fort Sumter was dire. Major Anderson's supplies were dwindling, and he estimated that his garrison could only hold out for a few more weeks. Lincoln faced an agonizing choice. To resupply Fort Sumter might be seen as an act of war by the Confederacy, potentially pushing border states like Virginia into secession. To abandon the fort, however, would be a tacit recognition of Confederate sovereignty and a blow to federal authority. Lincoln's cabinet was deeply divided. Secretary of State William H. Seward favored abandoning the fort to avoid war, believing that conciliation might bring the seceded states back. Others, like Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, argued for holding the fort at all costs, viewing it as a symbol of national unity. After much deliberation and influenced by reports from emissaries sent to Charleston, Lincoln decided on a compromise. He would attempt to resupply Fort Sumter with provisions only, not with men or munitions, unless the relief expedition was fired upon. He dispatched a letter to Governor Pickens of South Carolina, informing him of this intention. This placed the onus of initiating hostilities squarely on the Confederates. If they fired on an unarmed supply mission, they would be the aggressors. The Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, under President Jefferson Davis, saw Lincoln's resupply plan as a challenge. They believed that allowing the U.S. to maintain a presence in Charleston Harbor was an unacceptable infringement on Confederate sovereignty. On April 9th, Davis and his cabinet made the fateful decision to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter and, if refused, to reduce it by force. General Beauregard was instructed to deliver this ultimatum. On the afternoon of April 11th, 1861, 3 of Beauregard's aides, Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen D. Lee, and Lieutenant A. R. Chisholm, rode out to Fort Sumter under a flag of truce. They presented Major Anderson with the demand for immediate evacuation. Anderson, though his supplies were critically low, refused. He stated, "I shall await the first shot, and if you do not batter us to pieces, we shall be starved out in a few days." He also reportedly informed the Confederate emissaries that he would be forced to surrender by April 15th due to lack of food, a piece of information they relayed back to Beauregard. Unsatisfied with this conditional response, and perhaps fearing the imminent arrival of the Union relief expedition, which was indeed en route, though delayed by storms, Confederate Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker instructed Beauregard to demand an exact time for Anderson's surrender. If no satisfactory answer was given, Beauregard was to open fire. Just after midnight, in the early hours of April 12th, the same Confederate emissaries returned to Fort Sumter. Anderson, after consulting with his officers, reiterated that he could not evacuate immediately, but confirmed he would be forced to do so by noon on April 15th, unless resupplied or given different orders. This was still not enough for the Confederates. Colonel Chestnut, taking the lead, then wrote and handed Anderson a formal note. "Sir, By authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the Provisional Forces of the Confederate States, we have the honor to notify you that he will open the fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time. The time was 3:20 a.m. The die was cast. As the hour drew to a close, the atmosphere in Charleston Harbor was thick with anticipation. Civilians gathered on rooftops and along the battery in Charleston, awaiting the spectacle. Inside Fort Sumter, Anderson's men, awakened by the ultimatum, prepared for the inevitable. At precisely 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell arced high into the pre-dawn darkness from Fort Johnson on James Island. It exploded directly over Fort Sumter, a signal to the other Confederate batteries. Moments later, cannons from Fort Moultrie, Cummings Point on Morris Island, and other emplacements ringing the harbor roared to life, unleashing a furious bombardment on the Federal bastion. The first shot is often attributed to Lieutenant Henry S. Farley, commanding a battery at Fort Johnson. Another tradition credits Edmund Ruffin, an elderly Virginia secessionist and agriculturalist who had traveled to Charleston for the occasion, with firing one of the first shots from the iron battery at Cummings Point. Regardless of who fired the very first projectile, the Civil War had begun. The Confederate bombardment was relentless. More than 40 cannons and mortars rained down shot and shell on Fort Sumter. Anderson, with his limited ammunition and concern for his men's safety against the superior firepower, initially withheld his return fire. He had only about 60 cannons, many of which were in exposed positions or designed for naval attack, not for engaging land-based batteries. Furthermore, his supply of gunpowder cartridges was low. Around 7 a.m., Captain Abner Doubleday, Anderson's second-in-command, and later, though anecdotally, credited with inventing baseball, was given the honor of firing the Union's first retaliatory shot. The Union guns, though fewer and often less effective due to their positioning and the fort's unfinished state, began to engage the Confederate batteries. The duel continued throughout the day. The Confederates concentrated their fire on the fort's brick walls and attempted to set its wooden barracks ablaze with hot shot. Cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces before firing. Anderson, mindful of his dwindling supplies and the danger of a magazine explosion if the barracks caught fire, ordered his men to fire only sporadically and to conserve ammunition. The Union relief expedition, commanded by Gustavus V de Fox, arrived off the Charleston bar during the bombardment, but was unable to enter the harbor due to the heavy Confederate fire and rough seas. The warships accompanying the transports were also unable to effectively engage the Confederate batteries from a distance. The men inside Fort Sumter were on their own. Throughout April 12th, the shells continued to pound Fort Sumter. The thick brick walls, though scarred and battered, largely withstood the assault. However, the constant explosions and the risk of fire took a toll on the garrison. The wooden barracks did catch fire several times, forcing the Union soldiers to divert their efforts from manning the guns to firefighting. The Confederates, cheered on by the Charleston crowds, maintained their barrage. General Beauregard, from his headquarters in Charleston, directed the attack. He had meticulously planned the placement of his batteries to create a converging fire, ensuring that Sumter was struck from multiple angles. His artillerists, many of them volunteers and militia, performed with surprising skill and enthusiasm. The air was filled with the deafening roar of cannons, the shriek of shells, and the crash of masonry. Dust and smoke hung heavy over the harbour, at times obscuring the fort from the view of observers in the city. Inside Sumter, conditions were becoming increasingly difficult. The men were choked by smoke from the smouldering fires and the gunpowder. Their limited rations were quickly consumed. Despite the intensity of the Confederate fire, casualties on both sides were remarkably light during the first day. This was partly due to the strength of Sumter's walls and Anderson's cautious tactics, keeping his men sheltered. The Confederate gunners were also relatively safe behind their earthworks and fortifications. As night fell on April 12th, the bombardment eased, though it did not cease entirely. Confederate batteries continued to fire sporadically throughout the night, primarily to harass the garrison and prevent them from making repairs or resting. Anderson's men, exhausted from the day's ordeal, attempted to sleep amidst the intermittent shelling and the glowing embers of the burning barracks. They knew the respite was temporary, and that the dawn would bring a renewal of the assault. The morning of Saturday, April 13th, dawned grey and ominous. The Confederate batteries resumed their full-throated bombardment with renewed intensity. The primary target now became the wooden officers' quarters and barracks within Fort Sumter, which the Confederates hoped to set ablaze with hot shot. Their aim proved accurate. Soon, several fires were raging within the fort. The flames licked dangerously close to the main powder magazine, where nearly 300 barrels of gunpowder were stored. This posed an existential threat to the garrison. An explosion in the magazine would have utterly destroyed the fort and everyone in it. Major Anderson ordered his men to concentrate their efforts on fighting the fires and removing as much gunpowder as possible from the threatened magazine. This was perilous work. Barrels of powder were rolled out and in some cases thrown into the harbor to prevent them from exploding. The heat was intense and the smoke was suffocating. The Union flag, which had been flying proudly from a tall staff, was shot away around 1 p.m. on April 13th. Seeing the flag fall, some Confederate gunners mistakenly believed that Anderson had surrendered and briefly ceased firing, raising cheers. However, Sergeant Peter Hart, a former soldier who had re-enlisted to serve Anderson, bravely climbed a makeshift pole amidst the shelling and nailed the colors back up, a defiant gesture that was met with renewed Confederate fire. Despite this bravery, the situation within Fort Sumter was becoming untenable. The fires were out of control, the fort was filled with acrid smoke, and the men were exhausted and parched, their water supply nearly gone. The casemates, where the men sought shelter, were oven-like. Ammunition was almost entirely depleted. It was at this critical juncture, around 1:30 p.m., that a figure appeared at one of the fort's embrasures, waving a white handkerchief tied to a sword. This was former U.S. Senator Louis T. Wigfall of Texas, who was then serving as an aide-de-camp to General Beauregard. Wigfall, acting on his own initiative and without Beauregard's direct orders, had commandeered a small boat and rowed out to Fort Sumter under the heavy fire. Wigfall, a flamboyant and somewhat reckless character, managed to enter the fort and, finding Anderson, offered him terms of surrender. Wigfall claimed to be an emissary from Beauregard and stated that Anderson could evacuate with his command, taking arms and private property and salute his flag. Anderson, seeing no other option and believing Wigfall to be an official representative, agreed to these terms. The white flag of surrender was raised over Fort Sumter. Shortly thereafter, official emissaries from General Beauregard, including Stephen D. Lee, William Porcher Miles, and Roger Pryor, arrived at the fort. They were surprised to find the white flag flying and learned of Wigfall's unauthorized intervention. There was a moment of confusion, as Wigfall's terms were more generous than Beauregard had initially intended. However, after some discussion, and given Anderson's clear willingness to surrender, Beauregard largely honored the terms Wigfall had offered. The formal agreement stipulated that the U.S. garrison would evacuate the fort the following day, April 14th. They would be allowed to take their individual arms and company property. Crucially for Anderson and his men, they would be permitted a 100-gun salute to the U.S. flag before it was lowered. This was a matter of honor for the beleaguered garrison. The bombardment had lasted for 34 hours. Thousands of shells had been fired. Miraculously, despite the intensity of the shelling and the hazardous conditions, there had been no combat fatalities on either side during the actual engagement. The only Confederate casualty was a mule. On Sunday, April 14th, the evacuation ceremony took place. The remaining Union soldiers, weary but unbowed, assembled on the fort's parade ground. The U.S. flag, tattered and smoke-stained, was prepared for its final salute. As the cannons began to fire the salute, tragedy struck. During the 47th shot of the planned 100-gun salute, a cannon discharged prematurely. The explosion instantly killed Private Daniel Howe and mortally wounded Private Edward Galloway, who died a few days later. Several other gunners were injured. These were the first fatalities associated with the Fort Sumter engagement. Anderson, deeply distressed by the accident, ordered the salute cut short at 50 guns. After the abbreviated salute, the U.S. flag was lowered. Major Anderson and his men, carrying their arms and company property, marched out of Fort Sumter and boarded the Confederate transport steamer Isabel. From there, they were transferred to the Union relief ship Baltic, which was waiting outside the harbor. As they departed, Confederate soldiers entered Fort Sumter and raised the Confederate flag over the captured bastion. Charleston erupted in joyous celebration. The news of Fort Sumter's surrender electrified both the North and the South, though with vastly different emotions. In the South, it was seen as a glorious victory, a successful defiance of federal authority, and a confirmation of Confederate resolve. In the North, it was viewed as an outrageous act of rebellion, an attack on the nation's flag and sovereignty. On April 15th, 1861, the day after the evacuation, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to suppress the Southern Rebellion. This call for troops was the catalyst that pushed several more wavering Southern states, including Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. The nation was now irrevocably on the path to a full-scale civil war. Major Anderson returned to the North as a hero. He brought with him the tattered flag that had flown over Fort Sumter. This flag became a powerful symbol of Union loyalty and resistance, displayed at patriotic rallies throughout the North to encourage enlistment and support for the war effort. Fort Sumter itself remained in Confederate hands for nearly the entire war, despite repeated Union attempts to recapture it. It became a symbol of Confederate defiance. The fort endured numerous bombardments by Union naval and land forces, which reduced much of its original structure to rubble. However, Confederate defenders, through ingenious engineering and sheer tenacity, managed to hold on to the heavily damaged fort until February 1865, when General William T. Sherman's Union forces approached Charleston from the landward side, forcing the Confederates to evacuate the city and its harbor defenses, including Fort Sumter. On April 14th, 1865, exactly 4 years to the day after he had lowered it in surrender, Robert Anderson, by then a retired brevet major general, returned to Fort Sumter. In a highly symbolic ceremony, he raised the same tattered flag over the ruins of the fort. It was a poignant moment, occurring on the same day that President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Washington, D.C., though news of the assassination would not reach Fort Sumter until later. The Battle of Fort Sumter, though a relatively small military engagement with few casualties during the actual bombardment, was immense in its political and symbolic significance. It was the spark that ignited the American Civil War, a conflict that would last 4 brutal years, claim over 620,000 lives, and ultimately reshape the American nation, leading to the abolition of slavery and the reassertion of federal authority. The echoes of those first shots fired in Charleston Harbor reverberated through American history, marking a profound and tragic turning point for the United States. The decision to fire on the fort and the decision to resist set in motion a chain of events that neither side could fully control, plunging the nation into its bloodiest and most defining ordeal. The summer of 1861 was filled with a potent mixture of patriotic fervor and naive optimism, particularly in the northern states. Following the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April and President Abraham Lincoln's subsequent call for 75,000 volunteers, the Union rapidly assembled an army. The prevailing sentiment in Washington was that a single, decisive victory would crush the nascent Confederacy and bring the rebellious Southern states quickly back into the fold. The cry of "On to Richmond" echoed through the streets and in the press, urging swift action against the Confederate capital. This public and political pressure fell heavily upon Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, the commander of the newly formed Union Army of Northeastern Virginia. McDowell, a cautious and methodical officer, knew his troops were green and ill-prepared for a major offensive. They were largely 90-day volunteers, their enlistments rapidly nearing expiration, filled more with enthusiasm than with discipline or training. Despite his reservations, the demand for action was overwhelming. The primary Confederate force in Northern Virginia, the Army of the Potomac, Confederate, was under the command of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter. His army was positioned along Bull Run, a meandering stream near Manassas Junction, a vital railroad crossroads some 25 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. Beauregard, like McDowell, commanded an army largely composed of inexperienced volunteers. A smaller Confederate force, the Army of the Shenandoah, led by General Joseph E. Johnston, was stationed in the Shenandoah Valley, tasked with preventing Union forces there from reinforcing McDowell. McDowell's plan, developed under immense pressure, was to march his army of approximately 35,000 men south, engage Beauregard's roughly 22,000 Confederates, and overwhelm them. A key element of the Union strategy relied on Major General Robert Patterson's Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley to keep Johnston's 12,000 Confederates occupied, preventing them from reinforcing Beauregard at Manassas. On July 16, 1861, McDowell's army, a colorful and somewhat unruly procession, began its march out of Washington. The movement was slow and poorly organized, hampered by the troops' inexperience, inadequate logistical support, and the oppressive summer heat. It took them 2.5 days to cover the 20-odd miles to Centerville, Virginia, a delay that gave the Confederates ample time to prepare and, crucially, for Johnston to begin moving his forces. Beauregard, alerted to McDowell's advance, had deployed his army along an 8-mile stretch of Bull Run, covering the various fords and the strategically important Stone Bridge, where the Warrenton Turnpike crossed the stream. His initial plan was to attack the Union left flank, but McDowell's movements would soon force a change in Confederate dispositions. The critical development, unknown to McDowell for too long, was the Confederates' ingenious use of the Manassas Gap Railroad. General Johnston, eluding Patterson's larger but timidly led force in the valley, began to transport his troops eastward to reinforce Beauregard. This strategic movement by rail was one of the first significant uses of railroads for troop deployment in military history and would prove decisive. On July 18th, a preliminary Union probe at Blackburn's Ford on Bull Run was repulsed by Confederate defenders under Brigadier General James Longstreet. This minor engagement, though a Union setback, provided McDowell with some intelligence about Confederate positions, but also further delayed his main attack and perhaps increased his caution. McDowell spent the next 2 days scouting the Confederate right flank, looking for an undefended crossing point. Finding none, he revised his plan. He decided on a feint towards the Stone Bridge and Blackburn's Ford, while the main attacking force, 2 large divisions under Colonel David Hunter and Colonel Samuel P. Heintzelman, would make a long flanking march to the north, cross Bull Run at Sudley Springs Ford, and then sweep down to attack the Confederate left flank and rear. Colonel Daniel Tyler's division was to create a diversion at the Stone Bridge. In the pre-dawn darkness of Sunday, July 21st, 1861, McDowell's plan went into motion. The flanking column, numbering about 13,000 men, began its arduous march. However, the movement was slow, plagued by poor maps, difficult terrain, and the inexperience of the troops and their officers. They were hours behind schedule. Tyler's diversionary attack at the Stone Bridge began around 6 a.m., but was not pressed with enough vigor to deceive the Confederates fully. Colonel Nathan Shanks Evans, commanding a small Confederate brigade on the left flank near the Stone Bridge, soon realized the attack on his front was a feint. Alerted by signal flags and couriers about the large Union force moving towards Sudley Springs, Evans made a crucial independent decision. Leaving a small detachment to hold the bridge, he rushed the bulk of his brigade, about 900 men, northwest to intercept the Union flanking column on Matthews Hill. Around 9:30 a.m., Evans's small but determined force clashed with the leading elements of Hunter's division. For over an hour, this outnumbered Confederate brigade, later reinforced by troops under Brigadier General Barnard B. and Colonel Francis S. Bartow, stubbornly held its ground against the growing Union tide. Their resistance bought precious time for other Confederate units to redeploy and for Johnston's reinforcements to continue arriving at Manassas Junction. The fighting on Matthews Hill was intense. Both Hunter and Heintzelman were wounded. Despite the Confederates' spirited defense, the sheer weight of Union numbers eventually began to tell. By late morning, the Confederate line on Matthews Hill was crumbling, and they were forced to retreat in some disorder southward across the Warrenton Turnpike and up the slopes of Henry House Hill. At this point, a Union victory seemed within grasp. Many Northern soldiers, seeing the Confederates fall back, believed the battle was nearly won. Spectators, including congressmen and other civilians who had ridden out from Washington with picnic baskets to watch the show, shared this optimism. However, the Confederate retreat was not a rout. On the reverse slope of Henry House Hill, a Virginia brigade commanded by Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson was forming a strong defensive line. Jackson, a devout and eccentric former professor at the Virginia Military Institute, positioned his 5 Virginia regiments and a battery of artillery in a strategic position, sheltered from direct Union fire. As B's and Bartow's shattered brigades streamed past, B, trying to rally his men, reportedly pointed to Jackson's line and exclaimed, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians." From that moment, Thomas J. Jackson became Stonewall Jackson, and his brigade the Stonewall Brigade. The accuracy and exact wording of B's statement are debated by historians, but its inspirational effect and the nickname's endurance are undeniable. The battle now centered on Henry House Hill. McDowell, instead of organizing a coordinated assault, committed his regiments piecemeal. Union artillery batteries, including those of Captains James B. Ricketts and Charles Griffin, were advanced to the crest of the hill, where they engaged in a fierce duel with Confederate guns, often at close range. For several hours, control of the hilltop swayed back and forth. The 80-year-old Judith Carter Henry, an invalid civilian, was killed by artillery fire in her home, the Henry House, becoming one of the battle's tragic civilian casualties. During this critical phase, more of Johnston's troops, fresh from the Shenandoah Valley, began to arrive on the field, transported by train directly to Manassas Junction, and then marched to the battle. These reinforcements, including brigades under Colonel Jubal Early and Brigadier General Edmund Kirby Smith, who was wounded shortly after arriving, with Colonel Arnold Elzey taking command, bolstered the Confederate line at crucial moments. Around 4 p.m., with the Confederate line on Henry House Hill holding firm and fresh Confederate units pressing the Union flanks, the tide turned decisively. A Confederate counterattack, including a charge by the 33rd Virginia Infantry that overran Ricketts and Griffin's batteries, began to unravel the Union position. The Union soldiers, many of whom had been marching and fighting since early morning, were exhausted, thirsty and demoralized by the stubborn Confederate resistance and the arrival of enemy reinforcements. What began as an orderly Union retreat soon degenerated into a rout. As soldiers fell back across Bull Run, the sight of their comrades fleeing, coupled with rumors of Confederate cavalry attacks, which were largely unfounded but spread panic, caused discipline to collapse. The retreat became a disorganized scramble back towards Centerville and, for many, all the way to Washington. The Warrenton Turnpike became a scene of chaos. Fleeing soldiers mingled with the panicked civilian spectators, overturned wagons, and abandoned artillery pieces. The narrow Cub Run Bridge became a major bottleneck, further impeding the retreat and leading to the capture of more Union cannons and supplies. The Confederates, though victorious, were also disorganized and exhausted from the day's fighting. They were in no condition to mount an effective large-scale pursuit that could have threatened Washington, D.C., much to the later frustration of some Southern leaders. President Jefferson Davis himself had arrived on the field from Richmond towards the end of the battle and conferred with Johnston and Beauregard, but the decision was made not to press the advantage towards the Union capital that night. The First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, as it was known in the South, was a sobering shock to both sides. The Union, which had expected a swift and glorious victory, suffered a humiliating defeat. Approximately 460 Union soldiers were killed, 1,124 wounded, and 1,312 missing or captured, for a total of nearly 2,900 casualties. The Confederates lost about 387 killed, 1,582 wounded, and 13 missing, totaling just under 2,000. The battle's immediate aftermath was one of dismay in the North and jubilation in the South. For the Union, the Great Skedaddle, as the retreat was derisively called, exposed the Army's unpreparedness and shattered the illusion of a quick 90-day war. It led to a grim realization that the conflict would be long, bloody, and require a much greater national effort. In response to the defeat, President Lincoln appointed Major General George B. McClellan to command the Union forces around Washington. McClellan, a skilled organizer, would spend the next several months transforming the raw Union volunteers into the disciplined Army of the Potomac. Congress, sobered by the defeat, authorized the enlistment of up to 500,000 three-year volunteers. For the Confederacy, Bull Run was a significant early triumph. It boosted Southern morale, lent credibility to their cause in the eyes of foreign powers, though not enough to gain formal recognition, and reinforced the belief in the superiority of the Southern soldier. However, it may also have fostered a degree of overconfidence, leading some to believe the war was practically won. The First Battle of Bull Run was a brutal awakening. It demonstrated the deadly potential of modern weaponry, the importance of leadership and discipline, and the critical role of logistics and transportation, particularly railroads. It was a battle fought largely by amateur armies led by professional officers, and its chaotic and often confused nature reflected their shared inexperience. The fields along Bull Run, which had witnessed the first major land battle of the Civil War, were a stark preview of the immense sacrifices and profound transformations that lay ahead for the divided nation. The dream of a short, decisive war died that summer day on the plains of Manassas. While the eyes of the nation were largely fixed on the events unfolding in Virginia during the summer of 1861, a fierce and pivotal struggle for control was taking place in the border state of Missouri. Missouri's strategic importance, with its control of key stretches of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and its significant population, made it a critical prize for both the Union and the Confederacy. The state was deeply divided, with a pro-Union conditional government clashing with a pro-Confederate state government led by Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson. In this volatile environment, Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon emerged as the uncompromising and aggressive commander of Union forces in Missouri. Lyon, a fiery New Englander, was determined to keep Missouri firmly in the Union, by force if necessary. By early summer, he had successfully driven Governor Jackson and the pro-Confederate Missouri State Guard, commanded by Major General Sterling Price, out of the state capital, Jefferson City, and then from Boonville. Price and Jackson retreated southwestward, hoping to link up with Confederate forces from Arkansas and other southern states. Lyon pursued them relentlessly, despite having a small and often ill-equipped force. His primary objective was to prevent the Missouri State Guard from consolidating with other Confederate armies and to crush the secessionist movement in the state. By July 1861, Lyon's Army of the West, numbering around 5,800 men, was concentrated near Springfield in southwestern Missouri. Meanwhile, Sterling Price's Missouri State Guard, a poorly armed but spirited force of about 5,000, had indeed joined forces with Confederate regulars under Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch, a veteran Texan commander, and an Arkansas state force under Brigadier General N. Bart Pierce. This combined Southern Army, outnumbering Lyon's command with approximately 12,000 men, though many were poorly armed Missourians, was encamped along Wilson's Creek, about 10 miles southwest of Springfield. McCulloch, as the senior Confederate officer, held overall command, though his relationship with Price was sometimes strained by differing views on strategy and the capabilities of Price's irregular troops. Lyon, aware of the enemy's superior numbers but characteristically undaunted, faced a difficult decision. His 90-day volunteers, similar to those at Bull Run, were nearing the end of their enlistments. Reinforcements were not immediately forthcoming. Retreating would mean ceding southwestern Missouri to the Confederates and potentially demoralizing Unionists throughout the state. True to his aggressive nature, Lyon opted for a surprise attack, hoping to catch the larger Confederate force off guard and defeat it in detail. His plan was audacious and risky, particularly given his numerical inferiority. Lyon decided to divide his small army into 2 columns. He would personally lead about 4,200 men in a frontal assault from the north against the Confederate encampments along Wilson's Creek. The second column, about 1,200 men, under Colonel Franz Sigel, a German immigrant and experienced officer, was to make a wide flanking march to the south and east, cross Wilson's Creek, and attack the Confederate rear. The hope was that this pincer movement would sow confusion and panic among the more numerous but less organized Southern forces. Dividing a smaller force in the face of a larger enemy is a gamble, but Lyon believed surprise and aggression were his best weapons. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 10, 1861, Lyon's and Sigel's columns began their movements. Lyon's main force advanced southward from Springfield, while Sigel's column embarked on its longer flanking maneuver. The Confederates, despite some intelligence of a possible Union advance, were not fully prepared for an attack, many still asleep in their camps when the battle began. Around 5 a.m., Lyon's advance guard encountered Confederate pickets, and the battle commenced. The Union troops pushed forward, driving back the surprised Confederate cavalry and infantry. Lyon's men advanced across a prominent rise that would become known as Bloody Hill, pressing the Confederates southward along the creek. The initial Union assault was successful, catching several Confederate units, particularly those of Price's Missouri State Guard, off guard and forcing them into a hasty retreat. The fighting on the northern end of the field quickly intensified. Lyon, conspicuous on his horse and actively directing his troops, seemed to be everywhere, rallying his men and urging them forward. Confederate units, recovering from their initial surprise, began to form lines of resistance. McCulloch and Price worked to organize their commands and counter the Union thrust. The terrain, characterized by wooded hills, ravines, and thick underbrush, made coordinated movements difficult for both sides. Meanwhile, Sigel's flanking column to the south had also achieved initial success. Around 5:30 a.m., his artillery opened fire on the Confederate rear near the Sharp family farm, catching the Southern cavalry camps completely by surprise. Sigel's infantry advanced, pushing back the disorganized Confederates and capturing some of their supplies. For a time, it appeared Lyon's daring plan might succeed. The Confederates were caught between two attacking forces. However, Sigel's success was short-lived. After his initial advance, his column stalled. There are varying accounts for this. Some suggest Sigel became overconfident or failed to press his advantage aggressively. Others point to a lack of reconnaissance and communication. Crucially, Sigel's men, many of whom were German Americans, mistook a Confederate regiment dressed in gray, the 3rd Louisiana, which resembled some Union Iowa troops also in gray uniforms, for friendly forces. As the Louisiana troops approached, they unleashed a devastating volley at close range, followed by a charge. This sudden and unexpected attack shattered Sigel's left flank. His artillery was overrun, and his infantry, many of them raw recruits, broke and fled in panic. Sigel himself narrowly escaped capture. His flanking force, which had held such promise, effectively disintegrated as a fighting unit, its remnants streaming back towards Springfield in disorder. This collapse in the Confederate rear freed up McCulloch's southern units to turn their full attention to Lyon's main attack on Bloody Hill. Unaware of the disaster that had befallen Sigel's column, Lyon continued to press his attack on Bloody Hill. The fighting there was desperate and savage, some of the most intense of the early war. Control of the hill swayed back and forth as both sides launched attacks and counterattacks. Lyon's outnumbered force faced mounting pressure from Confederate units that were now able to concentrate against him. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. General Lyon was particularly exposed, riding along the lines to encourage his men. He was wounded twice, grazed on the head, and then shot in the leg. His horse was also killed. Despite his injuries, Lyon remained on the field, borrowing another mount. Around 9:30 a.m., while leading a charge of the 1st Iowa Infantry and 2nd Kansas Infantry to repulse a Confederate assault, Lyon was struck in the chest by a musket ball and killed instantly. He became the first Union general to die in combat in the Civil War. Command of the Union forces on Bloody Hill devolved upon Major Samuel D. Sturgis. The loss of Lyon was a severe blow to Union morale, but the Federal soldiers continued to fight with determination. The battle raged for several more hours under the hot August sun. The Confederates, under Price and McCulloch, launched repeated assaults against the Union position on Bloody Hill, but the Federal lines, though battered, held firm. The Pulaski, Arkansas Battery and Totten's Union Battery engaged in a fierce artillery duel, infantry on both sides, often firing at close range in the dense woods and cornfields, inflicted heavy losses. The Missouri State Guard, though poorly equipped, fought with considerable bravery, often led by Sterling Price himself. By late morning, around 11 a.m. or 11:30 a.m., Major Sturgis, realizing that his ammunition was running low, his men were exhausted, and there was no sign of Sigel's expected support. Indeed, rumors of Sigel's defeat were now reaching him, made the difficult decision to retreat. The Union forces began an orderly withdrawal from Bloody Hill, covered by their artillery and a rear guard. The Confederates, though they now held the field, were also severely bloodied and disorganized. They were in no condition to mount an effective pursuit of the retreating Union army. McCulloch, ever cautious and perhaps overestimating the remaining Union strength or concerned about his own army's state, chose not to follow up the victory aggressively. The Union Army was able to retreat back to Springfield and then further north to Rolla, Missouri, taking most of its wagons and supplies. The Battle of Wilson's Creek was a bloody affair, especially considering the relatively small numbers engaged compared to later Civil War battles. The Union suffered approximately 1,317 casualties, 258 killed, 873 wounded, 186 missing, captured, out of about 5,400 engaged. The Confederates and Missouri State Guard lost around 1,222, 277 killed, 945 wounded, out of approximately 12,000. Proportionally, the Union losses were much higher. Though a Confederate tactical victory in that they held the field at the end of the day, Wilson's Creek had mixed strategic results. The battle ensured Confederate control over southwestern Missouri for a time and boosted Southern morale in the Trans-Mississippi region. It also highlighted the fighting spirit of the Missouri State Guard. However, the Union Army, though defeated and forced to retreat, had not been destroyed. It had inflicted significant casualties on the Southern forces and had successfully withdrawn. More importantly, Lyon's aggressive campaign, culminating in Wilson's Creek, had arguably prevented Missouri from being completely overrun by secessionist forces early in the war. His actions, though ultimately costing him his life, had bought precious time for the Union to consolidate its hold on other parts of the state, particularly St. Louis and the crucial riverways. The death of Nathaniel Lyon was a significant loss for the Union cause in Missouri. He was a determined and energetic commander, and his leadership was sorely missed. Franz Sigel, on the other hand, saw his military reputation tarnished by the rout of his column, though he would continue to serve with mixed success throughout the war. For the Confederacy, the victory at Wilson's Creek was not without its problems. The uneasy relationship between McCulloch and Price persisted. McCulloch was hesitant to advance further north into Missouri without more supplies and a more disciplined force, while Price was eager to liberate the entire state. Soon after the battle, McCulloch would take his Confederate troops back to Arkansas, leaving Price and his Missourians to continue the campaign in Missouri on their own for a time. The Battle of Wilson's Creek was the first major Civil War engagement fought west of the Mississippi River. It demonstrated that the war would not be confined to the Eastern Theater and that the struggle for the border states would be fierce and bloody. The raw courage displayed by soldiers on both sides, many of whom were poorly trained volunteers, was a hallmark of the battle. It was a brutal introduction to the realities of war for the communities of the Ozarks, and a stark reminder of the deep divisions that tore at the fabric of the nation, even in its westernmost reaches. The sacrifice on Bloody Hill foreshadowed the immense human cost that would define the conflict in the years to come. In the autumn of 1861, following the Union debacle at the First Battle of Bull Run, Major General George B. McClellan was tasked with organizing and training the burgeoning Army of the Potomac. While large-scale offensive operations were largely on hold as McClellan drilled his new army, both Union and Confederate forces maintained picket lines and conducted reconnaissance along the Potomac River, which separated Union-held Maryland from Confederate Virginia. The political atmosphere in Washington remained tense, with public and political figures eager for any sign of Union military success, however small. One of the Union divisions stationed along the upper Potomac, near Poolesville, Maryland, was commanded by Brigadier General Charles P. Stone. Opposite his position, across the river near Leesburg, Virginia, was a Confederate force under the command of Colonel Nathan Shanks Evans, the hero of the Confederate left flank at First Bull Run. Leesburg was a strategically significant town, as it lay at the junction of important turnpikes and was a center of agricultural production. Union intelligence suspected it might be lightly defended. In mid-October, McClellan received ultimately false intelligence, suggesting that the Confederates might be withdrawing from the Leesburg area. On October 19, 1861, he ordered Brigadier General George A. McCall to conduct a reconnaissance in force from Drainesville, Virginia, towards Leesburg to ascertain the enemy's strength and intentions. Concurrently, McClellan instructed General Stone to make a slight demonstration on his front to distract the Confederates and support McCall's movement. This rather vague order for a slight demonstration would become a key point of contention and misinterpretation. Stone interpreted his orders as an opportunity for a more significant probe. On the evening of October 20th, he ordered elements of Colonel Charles Devon's 15th Massachusetts Infantry to cross the Potomac at Harrison's Island, a large island in the middle of the river, and then proceed to the Virginia shore to scout towards Leesburg. A small reconnaissance party under Captain Chase Philbrick crossed, and, in the darkness and unfamiliar terrain, mistakenly reported sighting an unguarded Confederate camp a short distance inland from Ball's Bluff, a steep, wooded cliff rising about 100 feet above the Potomac. Based on this faulty intelligence, General Stone, early on the morning of October 21st, ordered Colonel Devens to take a larger force of about 300 men from the 15th Massachusetts across to Ball's Bluff, advance on the supposed camp, and destroy it. He also ordered Colonel Edward D. Baker, a close friend of President Lincoln, a U.S. Senator from Oregon, and commander of the California Brigade, composed of Pennsylvania regiments, to take overall command at Edwards Ferry, a crossing point downstream from Ball's Bluff, and Harrison's Island. Baker was instructed to either reinforce Devens or withdraw his troops from the Virginia shore as he saw fit, based on his assessment of the situation. This discretionary order to Baker, a relatively inexperienced military commander despite his rank and enthusiasm, would prove fatal. Devens' men crossed to the Virginia shore in the pre-dawn hours of October 21st, using a few small, leaky flatboats that could only carry about 25 to 30 men at a time. The crossing was slow and difficult. Upon advancing inland, Devens quickly discovered that there was no Confederate camp as reported. Captain Philbrick's patrol had apparently mistaken shadows or trees for tents. Instead of withdrawing, Devens deployed his small force in a clearing near the bluff and sent word back to Stone of the situation. Meanwhile, Confederate pickets from the 17th Mississippi Infantry had detected the Union presence. Colonel Evans, alerted to the Union crossing, began to dispatch reinforcements to the area of Ball's Bluff. He initially sent companies from the 17th and 18th Mississippi, followed by elements of the 8th Virginia Infantry. As the morning progressed, skirmishing intensified between Devens' isolated command and the growing Confederate numbers. Devens requested reinforcements. General Stone ordered Colonel Baker to Harrison's Island to assess the situation. Baker, arriving mid-morning, learned of Devens' predicament and, without adequate reconnaissance or a clear understanding of the terrain or enemy strength, made the fateful decision to send more Union troops across the river to Ball's Bluff. He seems to have been eager for a fight and perhaps saw an opportunity for glory. The process of ferrying Union troops across the Potomac to the narrow landing at the foot of Ball's Bluff was woefully inadequate. Only a few small boats were available, and the current was swift. Reinforcements, including elements of Baker's own California Brigade, specifically the 1st California, which was actually the 71st Pennsylvania, under the 20th Massachusetts Infantry, known as the Harvard Regiment, due to its many well-educated young officers, trickled across in small numbers throughout the day. This piecemeal reinforcement meant that the Union force on the Virginia side never achieved numerical superiority and was fed into the battle incrementally. Colonel Baker himself crossed to Ball's Bluff around 2 p.m. and assumed direct command of the Union forces there, which by now numbered around 1,700 men. He found them deployed in a clearing, their backs to the high bluff, with wooded terrain to their front and flanks. It was a poor defensive position, offering little room to maneuver and no easy line of retreat, except back down the steep bluff and across the river in the few available boats. Baker, despite his lack of military experience, was a charismatic figure, and his presence initially lifted the spirits of his men. The Confederates, now under the direct command of Colonel Epper Hunton of the 8th Virginia, as Evans directed the overall Confederate response from Leesburg, continued to build up their strength. They skillfully used the wooded terrain to conceal their numbers and movements, gradually encircling the Union position. Confederate sharpshooters inflicted a steady stream of casualties on the exposed Union troops. Around 3 p.m., the Confederates launched a series of determined attacks. The fighting became intense and often at close range. The Union soldiers, many of them inexperienced, fought bravely but were hampered by their poor position and the piecemeal nature of their deployment. Ammunition began to run low for some Union units. Baker, conspicuous in his brigadier general's uniform, moved along the lines encouraging his men, seemingly oblivious to the growing danger. Sometime between 4:30 and 5 p.m., Colonel Baker was struck by a volley of Confederate bullets and killed instantly. His death threw the Union command structure into confusion and had a devastating impact on the morale of his troops. Command devolved upon Colonel Milton Cogswell of the 42nd New York Tammany Regiment, who had also crossed to the Bluff. With Baker dead and Confederate pressure mounting from 3 sides, the Union position became untenable. Cogswell attempted to organize a breakout towards Edwards Ferry to the southeast, where other Union forces under General Stone were positioned, but the attempt failed in the face of strong Confederate resistance. The Union line began to collapse. What followed was a scene of utter chaos and disaster for the Union forces. With their escape route to the north and south cut off, the only way out was back down the steep, treacherous slope of Bull's Bluff and across the Potomac River. Soldiers scrambled, slid, and fell down the bluff, many under heavy Confederate fire from the rim above. The few boats available were quickly swamped or sunk, overloaded with desperate men. Many soldiers, unable to find a boat, stripped off their equipment and attempted to swim the cold, swift-flowing river. Some drowned in the attempt. Others were shot in the water by Confederate soldiers firing from the bluff. The scene was one of panic and slaughter. A large flatboat, crowded with wounded and retreating soldiers, capsized, sending many to their deaths. Colonel Devens managed to swim to safety on Harrison's Island. Colonel Cogswell and many other Union officers and men were captured. The Confederates effectively sealed off the bluff, and the Union defeat was total. The Battle of Bull's Bluff was a relatively small engagement in terms of the numbers involved, but it was a shocking and disproportionately costly disaster for the Union. Out of approximately 1,720 Union soldiers engaged on the Virginia shore, around 223 were killed, 226 wounded, and 553 captured or missing, for a total loss of over 1,000 men, a casualty rate of nearly 50%. The Confederates, out of about 1,700 engaged, suffered only 36 killed, 117 wounded, and 2 missing, for a total of 155 casualties. The news of the Bull's Bluff fiasco sent shockwaves through the North. The death of Colonel Edward Baker, a sitting U.S. Senator and a personal friend of President Lincoln, was particularly stunning and brought the tragedy home to the highest levels of government. Lincoln was reportedly heartbroken by the news of Baker's death. The defeat at Bull's Bluff, following so closely on the heels of the Bull Run disaster, fueled public anger and frustration with the Union war effort. It led to intense scrutiny and a search for scapegoats. Brigadier General Charles P. Stone bore the brunt of the blame. Though McClellan initially supported Stone, political pressure mounted. In response to the Bluff disaster and other concerns about the conduct of the war, the U.S. Congress established the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War in December 1861. This powerful committee, dominated by radical Republicans, launched an investigation into Bluff. General Stone was called to testify. Vague accusations of disloyalty and incompetence, fueled by rumor and political maneuvering, swirled around him. Some even baselessly suggested he had traitorously communicated with the enemy. In February 1862, without formal charges or a trial, General Stone was arrested in a midnight raid in Washington, D.C., and imprisoned for 189 days, first at Fort Lafayette and then at Fort Hamilton in New York Harbor. He was never officially charged with any crime and was eventually released, his military career effectively ruined. The treatment of General Stone remains a controversial episode, seen by many as a gross injustice driven by political expediency and public hysteria. The Battle of Bluff had several significant consequences. It highlighted the dangers of poor reconnaissance, inadequate planning, and divided command. It underscored the critical importance of sufficient transportation for river crossings and the perils of committing troops piecemeal into battle. The disaster also had a chilling effect on Union commanders, making them even more cautious about undertaking offensive operations without overwhelming strength and meticulous preparation, arguably contributing to McClellan's later hesitancy. For the Confederacy, Bluff was another morale-boosting victory early in the war. It demonstrated the effectiveness of their troops in defending their home territory and inflicted a painful and embarrassing blow on the Union. Colonel Evans and his subordinate commanders were lauded for their skillful handling of the battle. The battlefield itself, a steep bluff overlooking the Potomac, became a somber reminder of the disaster. The bodies of many Union soldiers lay unburied for months or were hastily interred in shallow graves. The image of Union soldiers being shot down as they tried to escape across the river became a potent symbol of the battle's tragic outcome. Bluff, though overshadowed by larger and bloodier battles later in the war, played a significant role in shaping the early course of the conflict, particularly in its impact on Union political and military leadership and the public's perception of the war. It was a stark lesson in the harsh realities of combat and the severe consequences of military miscalculation, a fiasco that cost many lives and left deep scars on the national psyche. By early 1862, the Western theater of the American Civil War was becoming increasingly crucial. While much attention had been focused on Virginia, control of the major rivers in the West, the Mississippi, Tennessee, and Cumberland, was vital for both Union and Confederate war efforts. These rivers served as natural invasion routes into the heart of the Confederacy and were essential for troop movement and supply. The Confederates had constructed a series of forts to defend these waterways. Among them were Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, situated only about 12 miles apart in northern Tennessee, near the Kentucky border. These forts were intended to prevent Union gunboats and transports from penetrating deep into Confederate territory. However, their design and placement were flawed. Fort Henry, in particular, was poorly sited on low, swampy ground, vulnerable to flooding and dominated by higher terrain on the opposite bank of the river. In late January 1862, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, then a relatively unknown Union commander based in Cairo, Illinois, sought permission from his superior, Major General Henry W. Halleck, to launch an offensive against Fort Henry. Grant, unlike many of his more cautious counterparts, believed in aggressive action. He was supported in this endeavor by Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote, commander of the U.S. Navy's Western Gunboat Flotilla, a collection of recently built ironclad and timber-clad gunboats. Halleck, after some initial hesitation, authorized the joint Army-Navy expedition. Grant assembled a force of about 15,000 men and a fleet of 7 gunboats under Foote, 4 ironclads, USS Essex, Carondelet, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, and 3 timberclads, USS Conestoga, Tyler, and Lexington. The plan was for Foote's gunboats to bombard Fort Henry into submission, while Grant's troops surrounded the fort by land to cut off any escape and capture the garrison. Fort Henry was under the command of Confederate Brigadier General Lloyd Tilghman. The fort itself was an earthen pentagonal structure mounting 17 cannons, but only 11 of these could bear on the river approach. More critically, recent heavy rains had caused the Tennessee River to rise, flooding parts of the fort, including the powder magazine, and rendering some of its guns unusable. The garrison consisted of approximately 2,600 to 3,400 poorly armed and demoralized Confederate soldiers. Recognizing the untenable position of Fort Henry, especially with the river rising, General Tilghman made a crucial decision before the Union attack. He ordered the vast majority of his infantry garrison to evacuate Fort Henry and march overland to the much stronger Fort Donelson, 12 miles to the east on the Cumberland River. Tilghman himself, along with a small artillery detachment of about 90 to 100 men, remained behind in Fort Henry to man the guns and offer a token resistance, hoping to delay the Union advance and allow the bulk of his force to escape. On February 4th and 5th, Grant's troops disembarked from transports a few miles north of Fort Henry on both sides of the Tennessee River. Their advance was slowed by muddy roads and swampy terrain, a consequence of the same rains that were flooding the fort. On the morning of February 6, 1862, Flag Officer Foote's gunboat flotilla steamed up the Tennessee River to engage Fort Henry. Foote, aboard his flagship USS Cincinnati, led his ironclads in a line abreast, followed by the timberclads. Around 12:30 p.m., the Union gunboats opened fire on the fort from a range of about 1,700 yards. The Confederate gunners in Fort Henry, under Tilghman's direct command, bravely returned fire. Despite being heavily outnumbered and outgunned, and with parts of their fort underwater, they put up a spirited defense. Their artillery fire was initially accurate, striking the Union ironclads multiple times. The USS Essex was severely damaged when a 32-pounder Confederate shell penetrated its armor, struck a boiler, and released scalding steam, killing or wounding dozens of crewmen, including its commander, William D. Porter. the Essex was forced to drift out of the action. However, the firepower of the Union flotilla was overwhelming. The ironclads, though hit repeatedly, sustained mostly superficial damage, with the exception of the Essex. Their heavy guns, firing 8-inch shells and 32-pounder and 42-pounder solid shot, systematically silenced the Confederate cannons. One by one, Fort Henry's guns were knocked out of action or abandoned as casualties mounted among the small Confederate artillery crew. A lucky shot from the Cincinnati dismounted the Confederates' powerful 24-pounder rifled cannon. The naval bombardment was intense and accurate. General Tilghman, seeing that further resistance was hopeless and that his remaining guns were mostly disabled, decided to surrender. After just over an hour of fierce fighting, around 1:45 p.m. or 2 p.m. on February 6th, Tilghman ordered the Confederate flag lowered and a white flag raised over Fort Henry. Flag Officer Foote sent a boarding party ashore to accept the surrender. General Tilghman formally surrendered himself and his remaining men, about 70 to 90 effectives, plus some sick and wounded, to the Navy. Due to the muddy roads and the swiftness of the naval victory, General Grant's infantry arrived at Fort Henry only after the surrender had taken place. They had been unable to execute their part of the plan to encircle the fort and cut off the Confederate retreat. As a result, the vast majority of Tilghman's garrison, which had evacuated earlier, successfully reached Fort Donelson. This escape would have significant implications for the subsequent, much larger and bloodier battle at Fort Donelson. The Battle of Fort Henry itself was a relatively minor affair in terms of casualties, especially compared to later engagements. The Union Navy suffered about 40 casualties, mostly aboard the USS Essex. The Confederate garrison that remained in the fort suffered around 15 to 20 killed and wounded, with the rest captured. Despite its small scale, the capture of Fort Henry was a significant strategic victory for the Union. It opened the Tennessee River to Union gunboats and military traffic all the way to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, effectively outflanking major Confederate defensive positions and providing a crucial artery for future Union offensives into the Deep South. It was the first major Union victory in the Western Theater and a much-needed boost to Northern morale after the setbacks of 1861. The victory also brought Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant to national prominence for the first time. His famous dispatch to Halleck, "Fort Henry is ours. I shall take and destroy Fort Donelson on the 8th and return to Fort Henry," though perhaps overly optimistic in its timeline, demonstrated his characteristic determination and offensive mindset. Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote and the Western Gunboat Flotilla also received widespread acclaim for their role in the victory, highlighting the growing importance of naval power on the Western rivers. The ease with which Fort Henry fell demonstrated the vulnerability of fixed fortifications to naval bombardment, especially when those fortifications were poorly sited and inadequately armed. It also showcased the effectiveness of the new Union ironclad gunboats, which could withstand considerable punishment while delivering devastating fire. Following the capture of Fort Henry, Grant wasted little time in moving against Fort Donelson. The fall of Fort Henry was the first step in a campaign that would see Union forces gain control of much of Kentucky and western and middle Tennessee, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the war in the West. The Gibraltar of the West, as Fort Donelson was sometimes called, would prove a much tougher nut to crack, but the success at Fort Henry had paved the way. The opening of the Tennessee River was a blow from which the Confederacy in the West would struggle to recover. The swift Union victory at Fort Henry on February 6, 1862, was merely the prelude to a larger and far more consequential engagement. With the Tennessee River now open, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant immediately turned his attention to Fort Donelson, its Confederate counterpart on the Cumberland River, just 12 miles to the east. The capture of Fort Donelson was essential to secure Union control over western and middle Tennessee, and to open the Cumberland River as another avenue into the Confederate heartland. Fort Donelson was a more formidable defensive position than Fort Henry. Situated on a bluff about 100 feet above the Cumberland River near the small town of Dover, Tennessee, it commanded the river approaches effectively. The fort itself was a roughly 100-acre enclosure with strong earthworks, supported by 2 powerful water batteries equipped with heavy artillery, including a 10-inch Columbiad and a 32-pounder rifled gun designed to repel naval attacks. The landward side was protected by a line of entrenchments and rifle pits, extending for nearly 3 miles in an arc, anchored on Hickman Creek to the north and Lick Creek to the south. Following the evacuation of the bulk of the garrison from Fort Henry, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, the overall commander in the Western Theater, rushed reinforcements to Fort Donelson. He understood the critical importance of holding the fort to protect Nashville, Tennessee's capital, and a vital industrial center, which lay further up the Cumberland. By the time Grant's forces arrived, the Confederate garrison at Fort Donelson numbered around 17,000 to 21,000 men. Command within Fort Donelson was unfortunately divided and plagued by indecision. Johnston had initially placed Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson in charge, but then sent 3 more senior brigadier generals: John B. Floyd, a former U.S. Secretary of War with limited military experience; Gideon J. Pillow, a politically ambitious general with a controversial military record from the Mexican-American War; and Simon Bolivar Buckner, a more competent professional soldier and a pre-war friend of Grant. Floyd, as the senior officer, assumed overall command, but his leadership would prove hesitant and ineffective. Pillow, aggressive but often rash, frequently clashed with the others. Buckner, though capable, was often overruled. This command triumvirate was a recipe for disaster. Grant, after the fall of Fort Henry, planned to move his army overland the 12 miles to invest Fort Donelson. He was eager to strike quickly before the Confederates could further strengthen their position or receive more reinforcements. Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote's Western Gunboat Flotilla was to steam back down the Tennessee, then up the Ohio and Cumberland rivers to support the Army's attack on Fort Donelson, mirroring the successful joint operation at Fort Henry. Grant's army, initially about 15,000 strong, began its march from Fort Henry on February 11th and 12th, arriving before the outer defences of Fort Donelson on February 12th and 13th. The weather, which had been mild, took a turn for the worse, with freezing rain, sleet and snow creating miserable conditions for the soldiers, many of whom had discarded their blankets and overcoats during the unseasonably warm march from Fort Henry. As Grant's divisions, commanded by Brigadier Generals John A. McClernand, Charles F. Smith and Lew Wallace, whose division arrived as reinforcements, bringing Grant's total strength to around 27,000, began to encircle the Confederate entrenchments, skirmishing broke out. Grant established his lines, effectively investing the fort from the landward side, while awaiting the arrival of Foote's gunboats. On the afternoon of February 14th, Valentine's Day, Flag Officer Foote's flotilla of 4 ironclads, USS St. Louis, USS Cairo, USS Memphis, and USS New Orleans, Louis, Carondelet, Louisville, and Pittsburgh, and 2 timberclads, USS Tyler and Conestoga, advanced up the Cumberland River to attack Fort Donelson's water batteries. Foote was confident that his gunboats could replicate their success at Fort Henry. However, the situation at Donelson was vastly different. The Confederate water batteries at Fort Donelson were well sited on high ground, their guns plunging fire down onto the approaching Union vessels. The Confederate artillerists, under Captain Joseph Dixon at the lower battery and Captain Reuben R. Ross at the upper battery, served their guns with skill and determination. As the Union ironclads closed to within 400 yards, a furious artillery duel erupted. The Confederate heavy guns inflicted severe damage on Foote's flotilla. The flagship, USS St. Louis, was hit numerous times, its steering disabled, and Flag Officer Foote himself was wounded in the foot, an injury that would later contribute to his death. The USS Louisville and Pittsburgh were also heavily damaged and rendered unmanageable. The Carondelet, which had engaged the batteries earlier, had already suffered significant damage. After about an hour and a half of intense combat, the battered Union gunboats were forced to withdraw, their attack decisively repulsed. It was a significant setback for the Union and a morale boost for the Confederate defenders. The failure of the naval attack meant that Grant would have to rely solely on his army to capture Fort Donelson. Inside the fort, despite the successful defense against the gunboats, the Confederate commanders were growing increasingly anxious. They were surrounded by a superior Union force, supplies were adequate but not abundant, and the weather was taking its toll on their men. Generals Floyd and Pillow, fearing being trapped, decided on a desperate plan. They would attempt a breakout. Their aim was to attack the Union right flank, McClernand's division, near the Winds Ferry Road, clear a path to Nashville, and allow the bulk of the garrison to escape. Buckner, though he had reservations, was ordered to support the attack and then act as a rearguard. In the pre-dawn darkness of February 15th, under a blanket of snow, Pillow's division launched a furious assault on McClernand's unsuspecting troops. The Confederates, fighting with desperation, managed to push back the Union right flank, driving them nearly 2 miles and opening the escape route. McClernand's division, caught by surprise and running low on ammunition, fought stubbornly but was forced to give ground. The Confederate breakout seemed to be succeeding. However, Confederate command blunders then snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Pillow, believing the escape route was secure, inexplicably ordered his men to return to their entrenchments, to gather supplies before marching out. This decision, made without consulting Floyd or Buckner, squandered the tactical advantage they had gained and gave Grant precious time to react. Buckner, who had also made progress on his front, was stunned by the order to withdraw. General Grant had been away from the front lines that morning, conferring with the wounded flag officer Foote aboard his flagship. When he returned and learned of the Confederate attack and McClernand's precarious situation, he acted decisively. Observing that the captured Confederate haversacks were filled with rations, Grant correctly deduced that the Confederates were attempting to escape, not to achieve a decisive battlefield victory. He famously remarked, "The one who attacks first now will be victorious. The enemy have made a desperate effort to cut their way out and failed." Grant ordered an immediate counterattack. He directed General C.F. Smith, a stern, white-haired regular Army veteran, to assault the Confederate right flank, entrenchments that had been weakened when Buckner's troops were shifted to support Pillow's breakout attempt. Simultaneously, Lew Wallace's division was ordered to recapture the ground lost by McClernand on the Union right. Around 2 p.m., Smith, personally leading his division on horseback, launched a determined assault on the Confederate rifle pits held by Buckner's men. Despite heavy fire, Smith's troops, with bayonets fixed, surged forward and successfully breached the Confederate outer defenses, gaining a crucial foothold within the enemy lines. This was a critical turning point. On the Union right, Wallace's and McClernand's rallied troops also counterattacked, gradually regaining much of the ground they had lost earlier in the day. The Confederate breakout attempt had not only failed, but had resulted in the Union Army piercing their defensive perimeter. As night fell on February 15th, the situation for the Confederates inside Fort Donelson was dire. Their escape route was closed, their outer defenses breached, and Union forces were poised to renew the attack in the morning. The Confederate generals held a council of war in the small Dover Hotel. It was a scene of despair and recrimination. General Floyd, fearing capture and potential trial for treason due to his pre-war actions as Secretary of War, announced his intention to escape. He turned over command to General Pillow. Pillow, equally unwilling to be captured, quickly passed command to General Buckner. Both Floyd and Pillow then made their ignominious escapes. Floyd commandeered a steamboat and, along with about 1,500 Virginia troops, slipped away up the Cumberland River in the darkness. Pillow and his staff crossed the river in a small flatboat. Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest, the resourceful and aggressive Confederate cavalry commander, also refused to surrender. He declared he had not come to Donelson to surrender his command and would cut his way out. Leading his cavalry regiment and several hundred infantrymen, Forrest successfully forded the icy waters of Lick Creek and escaped eastward before dawn, a daring feat that foreshadowed his legendary wartime exploits. Left in command, General Simon Bolivar Buckner faced the grim reality. With no hope of escape and his position untenable, he knew further resistance would only lead to needless slaughter. Early on the morning of February 16th, Buckner sent a note to General Grant under a flag of truce, requesting terms of capitulation. Grant's response was blunt and uncompromising. "Sir, yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." Buckner, though he considered Grant's terms ungenerous and unchivalrous, given their prior friendship — Grant had once been financially assisted by Buckner — had no choice but to accept. He replied, "The distribution of the forces under my command, incident to an unexpected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your command, compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which you propose." On the morning of February 16, 1862, Fort Donelson was formally surrendered. Between 12,000 and 15,000 Confederate soldiers became prisoners of war, the largest single capture of enemy troops up to that point in American history. It was a staggering blow to the Confederacy. The Union victory at Fort Donelson was of immense strategic importance. It, along with the capture of Fort Henry, ensured Union control of Kentucky and opened up Tennessee for Union advances. The Cumberland River became a Union highway, leading directly to Nashville, which fell to Union forces without a fight on February 25th, becoming the first Confederate state capital to be captured. The loss of Forts Henry and Donelson and the vital resources and manpower of Middle Tennessee was a disaster from which the Confederacy in the West never fully recovered. The victory catapulted Ulysses S. Grant to national fame. His terse demand for unconditional and immediate surrender captured the Northern imagination and earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. He was quickly promoted to Major General of Volunteers. The Battle of Fort Donelson was a hard-fought and bloody engagement. Union casualties numbered around 2,691, 507 killed, 1,976 wounded, 208 missing captured. Confederate casualties, apart from those captured, were estimated at around 1,500 to 2,000 killed and wounded. The fall of Fort Donelson was a clear demonstration of Grant's tenacity and his ability to seize the initiative. It also highlighted the disastrous consequences of divided and incompetent Confederate leadership. The victory provided a much-needed boost to Union morale and signaled a significant shift in the strategic balance in the Western theater. The road to Shiloh, Vicksburg, and ultimately Union victory in the West began in earnest with the triumphs at Fort Henry, and most decisively, Fort Donelson. In the early months of 1862, while Union forces under Grant were achieving significant victories in Tennessee, another critical campaign was unfolding further west in the rugged terrain of northwestern Arkansas. This campaign would culminate in the Battle of Pea Ridge, also known as the Battle of Elkhorn Tavern, a fierce and complex engagement that would largely decide the fate of Missouri and secure Union control over a vast swath of the trans-Mississippi region. Following the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August 1861, Confederate forces under Major General Sterling Price had launched an offensive into Missouri, capturing Lexington. However, they were eventually forced to retreat back into Arkansas by numerically superior Union forces. By early 1862, Union Brigadier General Samuel R. Curtis had pushed his Army of the Southwest, numbering about 10,500 men, deep into northwestern Arkansas, aiming to destroy the Confederate forces in the region and end the threat to Missouri. Curtis established a strong defensive position along a stream called Little Sugar Creek near Bentonville. The Confederate commander in the Trans-Mississippi, Major General Earl Van Dorn, was an ambitious and energetic officer determined to reverse the recent Southern setbacks. Van Dorn, who had recently arrived to take overall command, managed to concentrate a diverse and somewhat unwieldy Confederate force of approximately 16,500 men. This army included Sterling Price's Missouri State Guardsmen, Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch's division of Confederate regulars, including troops from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and a contingent of Native American troops, primarily Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, commanded by Brigadier General Albert Pike. Pike's command included notable Cherokee leader Colonel Stand Watie. Van Dorn's plan was bold: to march rapidly north, bypass Curtis's prepared defenses at Little Sugar Creek, strike the Union Army in its rear, and destroy it, thereby reopening the way for a Confederate invasion of Missouri. On March 4, 1862, Van Dorn began his arduous march northward from the Boston Mountains. The weather was harsh, with freezing temperatures and snow, and his troops suffered from inadequate supplies and difficult roads. Despite these challenges, Van Dorn pressed on, driving his men hard. Curtis, alerted to the Confederate advance by his scouts and cavalry, initially believed Van Dorn would attack him directly at Little Sugar Creek. However, when he realized the Confederates were attempting a wide flanking maneuver to get behind him, Curtis reacted swiftly. On March 6th, Curtis ordered his army to change front, reorienting his divisions to face north and block Van Dorn's advance near Pea Ridge, a prominent elevation, and Elkhorn Tavern, a key hostelry and telegraph station on the main Telegraph Road, also known as the Wire Road, that ran from Springfield, Missouri to Fort Smith, Arkansas. This rapid redeployment, conducted in difficult winter conditions, was a testament to Curtis's skill and the discipline of his troops. He effectively turned his army 180 degrees to meet the unexpected threat from his rear. Van Dorn's plan involved dividing his army. He would personally lead Price's Missourians and some of McCulloch's men on a difficult night march around Pea Ridge via the Bentonville Detour to strike the Union rear near Elkhorn Tavern. McCulloch, with the remainder of his division and Pike's Native American brigade, was to take a shorter route and attack what he believed would be the Union flank near the western end of Pea Ridge, around a small village called Leetown. The two Confederate wings were to converge and crush Curtis's army between them. However, the difficult terrain, poor coordination, and the exhaustion of the Confederate troops would unravel this complex plan. The battle effectively began on the morning of March 7th. McCulloch's wing, advancing towards Leetown, encountered Union cavalry and then elements of Colonel Peter J. Osterhaus's division. The fighting in the dense woods and thickets around Leetown was confused and savage. Early in the engagement, a disaster struck the Confederate leadership. Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch, while scouting ahead of his lines, was shot and killed by Union skirmishers from the 36th Illinois Infantry. Shortly thereafter, Brigadier General James McIntosh, McCulloch's second-in-command, was also killed while leading a charge. The loss of both McCulloch and McIntosh in quick succession threw the Confederate left wing into chaos. Command devolved upon Colonel Louis Heber of the 3rd Louisiana, but he too became separated from his command and was later captured. Without effective leadership, the Confederate attack around Leetown lost its cohesion and momentum. Pike's Native American troops, though they fought bravely in some instances, were not well suited for conventional line-of-battle warfare and became disorganized. Some Cherokee troops were accused of scalping Union dead and wounded, an act that caused outrage in the North and further complicated the already fraught issue of Native American participation in the war. While McCulloch's attack was faltering near Leetown, Van Dorn and Price, after their grueling night march, finally emerged from the Bentonville detour and attacked the Union positions around Elkhorn Tavern late in the morning. The Union forces defending this sector were primarily from Colonel Eugene A. Carr's division. Carr's men, though outnumbered, put up a desperate and heroic defense of the tavern and the crucial Telegraph Road. The fighting around Elkhorn Tavern was some of the most intense of the battle. Control of the tavern and the surrounding high ground changed hands several times. General Curtis personally directed reinforcements to Carr's hard-pressed division. General Van Dorn and General Price were also actively involved in leading their troops. Carr himself was wounded 3 times, but refused to leave the field. The Confederates, despite their exhaustion, fought with great determination, gradually pushing Carr's division back. By nightfall on March 7th, the Confederates held Elkhorn Tavern and a portion of the Telegraph Road. But their victory in this sector had come at a high cost, and they were disorganized and low on ammunition. Crucially, Van Dorn had failed to link up with McCulloch's wing, which had been effectively neutralized near Leetown. Curtis, on the other hand, had successfully concentrated his forces and maintained his interior lines. During the night, Curtis consolidated his army into a strong defensive line facing north, with his artillery massed to command the approaches to Elkhorn Tavern. Van Dorn, despite his partial success, found himself in a difficult position. His army was divided, his men were exhausted and hungry, and his supply train had been delayed or lost on the Bentonville detour. He had also lost many key officers. On the morning of March 8th, Curtis seized the initiative. Around 8 a.m., he ordered a general Union counterattack. The Union artillery, skillfully handled and massed effectively, opened a devastating bombardment on the Confederate positions around Elkhorn Tavern. Under the cover of this artillery fire, the Union infantry advanced. The Confederate line, short of ammunition and physically spent, began to waver. Van Dorn, realizing his position was untenable and that he could not resupply his army, ordered a retreat. The Confederate withdrawal was initially orderly in some sectors, but became disorganized as Union pressure mounted. Many of Price's Missourians, their hopes of liberating their home state dashed once again, were particularly demoralized. By midday on March 8th, the Battle of Pea Ridge was over. Curtis's Army of the Southwest had won a decisive Union victory. Van Dorn's ambitious offensive had been shattered, and his army was forced into a long and difficult retreat through the rugged Ozark Mountains, eventually reaching Van Buren, Arkansas, in a depleted and demoralized state. The Battle of Pea Ridge was a hard-fought and costly engagement for both sides. Union casualties numbered around 1,384, 203 killed, 980 wounded, 201 missing, captured. Confederate losses were more difficult to determine accurately due to the disorganization of their retreat, but were estimated to be around 2,000, including many captured. The strategic consequences of Pea Ridge were profound. The Union victory secured Missouri firmly for the Union for the remainder of the war, ending any significant Confederate threat to the state. It also consolidated Union control over northwestern Arkansas and much of the Trans-Mississippi region. The defeat was a severe blow to Confederate hopes in the West and effectively crippled their ability to conduct major offensive operations in the region for a considerable time. Several factors contributed to the Union victory. General Curtis's calm and skillful leadership, particularly his rapid redeployment of his army and his effective use of artillery, was crucial. The disorganization and leadership failures within the Confederate Army, especially the loss of McCulloch and McIntosh and the logistical problems encountered by Van Dorn, also played a significant role. The determination of the Union soldiers, many of whom were from Midwestern states like Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, was another key factor. The Battle of Pea Ridge was one of the few Civil War battles in which a Union army was outnumbered but still emerged victorious. It was also notable for the significant participation of Native American troops on the Confederate side, highlighting the complex and often tragic involvement of indigenous peoples in the conflict. For General Earl Van Dorn, Pea Ridge was a bitter disappointment. His bold plan had come to naught, and his reputation suffered. He would later be transferred to command troops in Mississippi. For General Samuel Curtis, Pea Ridge was the pinnacle of his military career, a well-earned victory that demonstrated his capabilities as a field commander. The battlefield itself, with its rugged ridges, dense forests, and the iconic Elkhorn Tavern, stands as a testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the strategic importance of this often overlooked Western theater engagement. The fight for Missouri and the Trans-Mississippi had been largely decided in the cold, windswept hills of Pea Ridge. The early spring of 1862 witnessed a naval engagement that, while tactically inconclusive, would forever alter the course of maritime warfare. The Battle of Hampton Roads, fought on March 8th to 9th, 1862, in the waters off Sewell's Point, Virginia, pitted two revolutionary ironclad warships against each other for the first time. The Confederate CSS Virginia, formerly USS Merrimack, and the Union USS Monitor. This clash not only had significant implications for the American Civil War, but also signaled the obsolescence of wooden-hulled warships and ushered in the age of armored naval vessels. Since the outbreak of the war, the Union Navy had established a blockade of southern ports, aiming to cripple the Confederacy's ability to import manufactured goods and export cotton. Hampton Roads, a large natural harbor at the confluence of the James, Nansemond, and Elizabeth rivers, leading into Chesapeake Bay, was a key strategic point. It was the gateway to Norfolk, home to the Gosport Navy Yard, which the Confederates had seized, and to Richmond, the Confederate capital, via the James River. The Union maintained a powerful squadron of conventional wooden warships at Hampton Roads to enforce the blockade and protect Union-held Fortress Monroe at Old Point Comfort. The Confederacy, lacking the industrial capacity to build a navy that could challenge the Union on equal terms, sought innovative ways to break the blockade. One such effort centered on the captured Union steam frigate USS Merrimac. When Federal forces abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk in April 1861, they scuttled and burned the Merrimac to prevent its capture. However, the Confederates managed to raise the Merrimac's burned hull and, under the ingenious direction of naval constructor John L. Porter and Lieutenant John M. Brooke, began to convert it into a formidable ironclad warship. The wooden superstructure was cut down to the waterline, and a thick, sloping casemate, armoured with 2 layers of 2-inch iron plating backed by heavy oak and pine, was constructed on its deck. This casemate housed 10 heavy guns, 6 9-inch Dahlgren smoothbores, 2 6.4-inch Brooke rifles, and 2 7-inch Brooke rifles. The vessel was also fitted with a formidable cast-iron ram on its bow. Renamed the CSS Virginia, this radically redesigned warship was slow and unwieldy, with a deep draft that limited its maneuverability in shallow waters, but it was hoped its armor would make it impervious to Union naval gunfire. Its commander was Flag Officer Franklin Buchanan, a veteran U.S. Navy officer who had sided with the Confederacy. Meanwhile, in the north, news of the Virginia's construction caused considerable alarm. John Ericsson, a brilliant Swedish-American inventor, had designed an equally revolutionary ironclad vessel for the Union Navy. Ericsson's design was a radical departure from traditional warships. It featured a low-slung, raft-like hull, with most of the vessel sitting below the waterline, presenting a minimal target. Its most distinctive feature was a revolving cylindrical turret, protected by 8 inches of iron armor, housing 2 powerful 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbore cannons. This vessel, named the USS Monitor, was constructed with remarkable speed at the Continental Iron Works in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and launched on January 30th, 1862. Commanded by Lieutenant John L. Worden, the Monitor was dispatched southward in early March, with orders to proceed to Hampton Roads. On the morning of March 8th, 1862, before the Monitor had arrived, the CSS Virginia steamed out from Norfolk into Hampton Roads, accompanied by several smaller Confederate gunboats, CSS Beaufort and Raleigh. Its mission was to destroy the Union blockading squadron, which consisted of several powerful wooden steam frigates and sailing sloops, including the USS Cumberland, USS Congress, USS Minnesota, USS Roanoke, and USS St. Lawrence. The appearance of the strange, low-slung, smoke-belching Virginia caused consternation among the Union fleet. The Union warships initially opened fire, but their cannonballs largely bounced harmlessly off the Virginia's sloped iron armor. The Confederate ironclad, impervious to their shells, steamed steadily towards the USS Cumberland, a 24-gun sailing sloop. Around 2 p.m., the Virginia rammed the Cumberland on its starboard bow, its iron ram tearing a huge hole in the wooden hull. As the Cumberland began to sink, the Virginia also poured devastating broadsides into it. The Cumberland fought back gallantly, its guns firing until the water engulfed them, but it was doomed. It sank with its colors still flying, taking over 100 Union sailors with it. The Virginia's ram was wrenched off in the collision, a significant but not immediately debilitating loss. Next, the Virginia turned its attention to the USS Congress, a 50-gun frigate. The Congress, seeing the fate of the Cumberland, had run aground in shallow water while attempting to maneuver. The Virginia took up a raking position and pounded the helpless Congress with shell fire. The wooden frigate was soon set ablaze, and its commander, Lieutenant Joseph B. Smith, was killed. Around 4:30 p.m., the Congress surrendered. Later that evening, its magazine exploded, destroying the ship in a spectacular conflagration. During this time, the USS Minnesota, a large steam frigate, had also run aground while attempting to engage the Virginia. The Confederate ironclad, along with its accompanying gunboats, then targeted the Minnesota, but the fading daylight and the receding tide prevented the deep-draft Virginia from closing in for the kill. Flag Officer Buchanan was wounded in the thigh by rifle fire from shore during the engagement with the Congress, and command of the Virginia passed to Lieutenant Catesby A.P. Roger Jones. As darkness fell, the Virginia, confident of finishing off the Minnesota and the rest of the Union wooden fleet the next day, withdrew to the Confederate anchorage off Sewell's Point. The first day of the Battle of Hampton Roads had been an unmitigated disaster for the Union Navy. 2 of its powerful wooden warships were destroyed, another was aground and vulnerable, and the Confederate ironclad seemed unstoppable. Panic spread through the North. There were fears that the Virginia could steam up the Potomac to Washington, D.C., or attack other northern coastal cities. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was reportedly terrified, believing the Virginia would change the whole character of the war. However, during the night of March 8th, a savior arrived for the Union. The USS Monitor, after a perilous sea voyage from New York during which it nearly foundered, steamed into Hampton Roads around 9 p.m. and took up a defensive position near the stranded USS Minnesota. Its arrival was timely and, for the Confederates, entirely unexpected. On the morning of Sunday, March 9th, the CSS Virginia re-emerged, intending to complete the destruction of the USS Minnesota. As it approached, the small, strange-looking Monitor steamed out to meet it. The Confederate crew aboard the Virginia were initially perplexed by this cheese box on a raft, as it was later described. Around 8:45 a.m., the 2 ironclads opened fire on each other, initiating the first-ever battle between armored warships. For the next 4 hours, the Virginia and the Monitor engaged in a unique and historic duel, often at very close range. The Monitor, being much more maneuverable and having a shallower draft, could outmaneuver the cumbersome Virginia. Its revolving turret allowed it to fire its 2 heavy guns in any direction, independent of the ship's orientation. The Virginia, with its fixed broadside guns, had to turn its entire bulk to bring its armament to bear. Both vessels fired repeatedly at each other. The heavy shot from the Virginia's guns struck the Monitor's turret and hull numerous times, but failed to penetrate its thick armor, though the impacts were deafening to the crew inside. Similarly, the Monitor's 11-inch Dahlgren guns, though powerful, also failed to inflict critical damage on the Virginia's sloped casemate. Union naval regulations at the time limited the powder charge for the Dahlgrens, fearing the guns might burst. Had full charges been used, the outcome might have been different. The battle was a frustrating stalemate for both sides. The Monitor's primary mission was to protect the Minnesota, and it successfully did so, interposing itself between the Confederate ironclad and the vulnerable wooden frigate. The Virginia attempted to ram the Monitor at one point, but the Monitor's agility allowed it to evade a direct hit, and the Virginia only dealt a glancing blow, having lost its main ram the previous day. Around noon, a Confederate shell struck the Monitor's pilot house, a small armoured box near the bow from which Lieutenant Worden was conning the ship. The explosion temporarily blinded Worden and forced him to relinquish command to Lieutenant Samuel Dana Green. The Monitor briefly disengaged and drifted into shallower water while Worden's injuries were attended to. Lieutenant Jones on the Virginia, seeing the Monitor withdraw and believing it to be seriously damaged or retreating, and with his own vessel having sustained some minor damage, leaks, damaged armor plates, and a jammed gunport shutter, and concerned about the falling tide, decided to break off the engagement. The Virginia steamed back towards Norfolk. When Lieutenant Green on the Monitor was ready to re-engage, he found the Virginia already departing. The Monitor fired a few parting shots, but did not pursue. The battle thus ended in a tactical draw. Neither vessel had destroyed or decisively defeated the other. However, strategically, the outcome was a victory for the Union. The Monitor had successfully defended the Minnesota and the rest of the Union wooden fleet, and it had neutralized the threat posed by the Virginia. The Confederate ironclad, while still a formidable presence, could no longer roam Hampton Roads unchallenged. The Union blockade remained intact. The Battle of Hampton Roads had immediate and far-reaching consequences. It revolutionized naval warfare overnight. The world's major navies, observing the battle, realized that wooden-hulled warships were now obsolete. The age of the ironclad had dawned. A global naval arms race ensued, with nations scrambling to build their own armored fleets. For the remainder of its service, the CSS Virginia remained a threat, bottling up the Union fleet in Hampton Roads and preventing a direct naval assault up the James River towards Richmond. However, it never again achieved the kind of success it had on March 8th. In May 1862, when Confederate forces were forced to abandon Norfolk and the Gosport Navy Yard due to McClellan's Peninsula campaign, the Virginia, with its deep draft, could not retreat up the James River. To prevent its capture, its Confederate crew scuttled and burned the pioneering ironclad off Craney Island on May 11th, 1862. The USS Monitor also had a relatively short career. It served effectively in the James River, supporting McClellan's campaign. However, on December 31st, 1862, while being towed south, the Monitor encountered a storm off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Its low freeboard and poor seaworthiness in heavy seas proved its undoing. It foundered and sank, taking 16 crew members with it. Its wreck was discovered in 1973 and is now a U.S. National Marine Sanctuary. The clash between the Monitor and the Virginia was more than just a naval battle. It was a technological turning point. It showcased the superiority of armored vessels and the innovative spirit of both Union and Confederate engineers. Though their individual careers were brief, these two ironclads left an indelible mark on naval history, forever changing the way wars would be fought on the seas.